Either Dorothy goes after me again, or Kitty gets it.
Or be a sporting loser. Men behaving badly at 9:30 and they think it's all over at 10. Tonight on BBC One.
Another silent spring in the countryside. Where have all the songbirds gone? Ask the farmers in a moment on BBC Two. On BBC One, the 9 o'clock news with Michael Buerk.
Tony Blair's warned his MPs against sleaze. You're the people's servants, not their masters, he said, before they packed the government benches for the first time since the 70s. Bosnia's first convicted war criminal faces life imprisonment, and the report that says drugs are being used on the elderly as a chemical ball and chain. Good evening. Labour's massive victory in the general election took visible shape in Parliament today as their new MPs overflowed the government benches, and Tony Blair and John Major faced each other from different sides of the chamber. Earlier, the Prime Minister had warned his MPs that they must uphold the highest standards in public life. You're not here to enjoy the trappings of power, but to do a job, he said. From Westminster, our political editor Robin Oakley.
Tony Blair arrived to a round of applause. After 18 years waiting, his exultant MPs weren't going to restrict themselves to the traditional hear-hears. But if it is a very different House of Commons, it still required the old ceremonial, led by Sir Edward Heath, the father of the House, to re-elect the Speaker. After Betty Boothroyd had been escorted once again to the chair, it was time for graceful tributes. The new Prime Minister acknowledged their common problem, a comforting one for him.
Now, Madam Speaker-elect, there are many new faces, as you have said, for you to get used to. Indeed, there are many new faces for me to get used to.
With his MPs now spread on 3 rows, the Liberal Democrats leader too had something to celebrate.
For me to be able to use that phrase, these benches, on this occasion with the same feeling, but on this occasion with a little more accuracy than I've used it before, gives me pleasure too.
And with wry humour about his changing status, John Major appealed to the Speaker to continue looking after the lower ranks.
I'm a frontbencher who wishes in due course to become a backbencher. So let me assert that the rights of backbenchers are as important.
Earlier, Labour's happy MPs had to hold their first meeting in nearby Church House. No room in the Commons big enough for them. More than 100 now are women. Many have won seats earlier than they'd expected to. Their leader cautioned them to show due humility.
We are not the masters. The people are the masters. And we are the servants of the people. We will never forget that. And if we ever do, then the people will very soon show that what the electorate gives, the electorate can take away.
Mr. Blair said they had the chance to do something spectacular. He promised a government without dogma, and he warned his MPs not to slip into the indiscipline which had brought down the Tories, sparing neither rebel nor loyalist.
Look at the Tory party now. Pause, reflect, then vow never to let us emulate them. Of course, speak your minds, but realize why you are here. You are here because of the Labour Party, and you owe that loyalty to the Labour Party.
The Liberal Democrat leader enjoyed an historic photo opportunity with his MPs, more than double the number before the election. He's promising support for the government if it's constructive on issues like Europe. And today, Mr. Blair underlined his readiness for cooperation both with Europe and with business, with the unusual appointment of Euro enthusiast industrialist Sir David Simon, the BP chairman, as the new Minister for Trade and Competitiveness in Europe. There's a very different feel at Westminster this week, a real sense of movement. And tomorrow the new Labour cabinet meets for the first time to discuss the measures in next week's Queen's speech. Education, health and crime bills are the priorities. And there'll be more bad news for the Tories, with plans to compel disclosure of party funding. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Westminster.
2 more members of the last cabinet have entered the contest for the Conservative Party leadership, bringing the number of candidates up to 6. Launching his bid, the former Welsh Secretary William Hague said the party had to be willing to change almost everything except its principles. The former Health Secretary Stephen Dorrell claimed he could unite the party. Our political correspondent John Pienaar reports.
William Hague is saying he decided to run for the leadership as late as yesterday, but his campaign certainly looked well organised today. The glossy stage set was the backdrop to a professional effort to promote the youngest candidate in a six-man field. He offered himself as the right man to make a fresh start.
We must not follow the example of New Labour in changing or abandoning our basic principles: the freedom of the individual, the promotion of thrift, the rewarding of hard work and personal responsibility. But we must be prepared to change almost anything else.
His campaign team were pleased with a polished performance. They say he's also the classless contender, capable of reaching people and places lost to the Tories.
We're going to do it by electing a leader who was born and brought up in the north of England, in an urban area, went to a comprehensive school, and knows the north of England and Wales more intimately than anywhere else in Britain.
Today's other new candidate declared his intention to stand in a letter to Tory MPs this morning. He was upbeat about his chances.
I've had a large number of people ringing and expressing support, and I think it's going well. It's going, from my point of view, very encouragingly, but in the end, of course, it is for the party to decide.
By this afternoon, he wanted to show plenty of friends wanted to join his gang. They'll try to persuade Eurosceptic colleagues Mr. Dorrell shares their opposition to a European currency. Peter Lilley's a candidate who's already set down a tough line on Europe, and now he's been endorsed by his former cabinet colleague, Gillian Shepherd. For the Tories, life goes on. Kenneth Clarke went to the first meeting of what's now the shadow cabinet. Some had to ask the way to the right room. The Tories are coming to terms with the scale of their defeat. John Major's having to plug the holes in his team by acting as foreign and defence spokesman, as well as shadowing Tony Blair. The leadership election will be managed by the Backbench 1922 committee, and they'll be elected on May the 21st. That could mean a contest in mid-June. Tory veterans and newcomers have been arriving at Westminster to take their place in what's left of their party. They'll decide which candidate is best placed to win back lost supporters, and how to take on a Labour Party that dominates the middle ground of politics as much as it dominates the House of Commons. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
The Foreign Secretary Robin Cook has agreed with his French and German counterparts to work for a global ban on landmines. Mr. Cook has been visiting Paris and Bonn today on his first official trip abroad. He said Britain wanted a fresh start in relations with Europe. A Bosnian Serb has become the first person to be convicted of crimes against humanity during the country's civil war. The UN tribunal in The Hague found Dusan Tadic guilty of the torture, persecution and killing of Muslim prisoners at a Serb-run camp. He's due to be sentenced in July, but his lawyers say he'll appeal against the verdicts. Our Europe correspondent James Robbins reports.
A year to the day since this trial opened, Dusan Tadic arrived at court simply a cafe owner and karate instructor from northwest Bosnia. After today's judgment at The Hague, he's a war criminal. Tadic, flanked by United Nations guards, heard the American presiding judge convict him of persecution, torture and killings amounting to crimes against humanity.
Count 1, guilty. Count 6, not guilty. Count 10, guilty. Count 11, guilty.
During the trial, the court heard harrowing accounts from survivors of concentration camps where Serbs held civilian prisoners at the height of the war 5 years ago. At Omarska, Tadic rounded up Muslims and led beatings and killings of victims selected purely on the basis of their religion and politics. Tadic was found not guilty on 9 specific counts of murder. Still, he faces possible life imprisonment when sentenced in July, but he intends to appeal. The Chief Prosecutor insists the judgment demonstrates both fairness and the gravity of the convictions.
It underlined that the killing was actually pursued for discriminatory reason. It's the heart of the Nuremberg conception of crimes against humanity.
But the men who organized and directed the terror are still free. Both Army Commander Ratko Mladic and the Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic are wanted men indicted by this tribunal. Western governments with forces in the area have consistently refused to risk bloodshed to arrest them. Outside court today, the personal lawyer for Radovan Karadzic was openly scornful.
I am not so sure that they will try to do that, because it's a very, very risky operation. And I would not suggest it to any of members of Western governments.
We have seen a lot of high-ranking politicians pay lip service to the issue of the need for having justice as a means of having reconciliation and lasting peace in Bosnia. What we have not seen is to put political power and will behind that to actually get justice done.
So the symbolic message in today's verdict is blunted. Governments around the world want to show that all crimes against humanity will always be punished in future. But so far, Dusan Tadic is the only man convicted of war crimes committed on a massive scale in Europe in the 1990s. James Robbins, BBC News, The Hague.
And there'll be a special programme tonight on the biggest trial of its kind since the Second World War. War Crimes on Trial is on BBC Two at 9:45. President Mobutu of Zaire has left the country for talks in nearby Gabon. His aides claim that he'll return, but it's widely thought he'll now go into exile. In Kinshasa, it's been reported that 200 civilians, including 10 Red Cross workers, have been killed in fighting between the rebel and government troops around the town of Kenge, 125 miles east of the capital. From Zaire, George Alagaya reports.
The Mobutu motorcade speeding to and from the airport has become a very familiar sight. Only today there's intense speculation over whether this is a flight into exile, the end of an era. Government officials say the president will be back, that he wouldn't abandon the country he's ruled for over 3 decades. In Kinshasa, General Maheli, the head of the army, has been rallying his troops. First reports from the front line, some 120 miles from here, suggest the fighting has been far more savage than in any of the previous battles in this civil war. Government troops who fled in the face of the rebels before may now be making a last stand.
According to the missionaries locally, they say the clashes have been very violent and that there were between 200 to 300 deaths, that a lot of civilian people have been killed also. Of course, this has to be confirmed, but this is what the information that we got first-hand from people on the field there.
On the streets, the Parliament of the People, they call it, the debate is not about whether Mobutu will go, but what to do when he's gone. They point to the infrastructural decay that followed his corrupt rule. They reject everything he stood for, even the language inherited from colonial times.
From today, the Zaire people like to speak English, no French. Today, Mobutu must go back forever. Do you understand? Mobutu must go forever. We don't like it here in the country.
Those who have a choice are pulling out. This barge is taking four-wheel drive vehicles, often the target of the army when it has gone on the rampage before, to neighbouring Congo for safety. There's a steady flow of people leaving the country by air too. Some international airlines have diverted their incoming flights to nearby Brazzaville, citing security as the reason.
My family and me, I am scared because the first military of Mobutu and Kabila maybe have problems. That's why I'm moving.
If President Mobutu has indeed fled the country, he'd be joining a growing list of his cronies who've already deserted their posts. When those who've gained most from Mobutuism lose confidence, the end can't be very far off. George Alagaya, BBC News, Kinshasa.
Here, nearly half of the old people in residential and nursing homes are prescribed tranquilisers and sedatives, according to a report from the Royal College of Physicians. It says overuse of drugs can be dangerous and lead to serious side effects. It calls on doctors to review the way drugs are handed out.
The residents at Risby Hall Nursing Home near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk have a variety of chronic conditions, ranging from multiple sclerosis to arthritis. Most are on 5 or 6 different drugs, but hardly any are on sedatives. That's in stark contrast to the situation elsewhere. The authors of today's report say nationally, nearly half of all residents are taking tranquilisers and sedatives.
This really can't be right and could be likened to a chemical ball and chain. What we think the general practitioners should be doing is referring such patients to the local psychiatrist of special interest in the elderly, or perhaps the community psychiatric nurse, to review the need for this medicine. Can it be removed altogether, or perhaps the dose reduced? But it does need to be reviewed.
The number of old people in residential and nursing homes has increased 6-fold in little more than a decade, leading to a growing burden on local doctors. At Risby Hall, as many as 15 different GPs are involved in prescribing drugs. The Royal College of Physicians recommends that one doctor should take an overview at each home.
Last one.
Care home owners point out that although it's their nurses who give out drugs day to day, the ultimate responsibility for prescribing still rests with GPs.
In the vast majority of cases, prescribing is wholly appropriate and well controlled by both the professional nursing staff and by the general practitioners. However, we wouldn't pretend that the inappropriate prescribing doesn't happen in a small minority of cases.
The authors of today's report fear that in homes where tranquilizers are widely used, residents are sometimes sedated to keep them quiet and easy to manage. In America, it's a practice known as switching the patients out with the lights. 3/4 of all drugs given to the elderly are repeat prescriptions, and doctors are being urged to review what drugs patients receive. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
In the Court of Appeal, the Crown has admitted that none of the convictions in the case of the 4 men jailed for the killing of the newspaper boy, Carl Bridgewater, can now be regarded as safe. Michael Hickey, his cousin Vincent and James Robinson, who all served 18 years in jail, were granted unconditional bail by the court in February. BSkyB is joining forces with British Telecom to launch its own version of interactive television, giving access to the internet, home shopping and banking through a set-top box. The same device will also decode the 200 digital TV channels BSkyB is planning to launch. Cable companies are starting their own interactive services this autumn. The chemicals giant ICI is buying a number of companies from Unilever in one of the biggest deals in British business history. ICI will pay £5 billion for the firms, which make products ranging from food flavourings to starch. The Sea Empress, the tanker which spilled 70,000 tonnes of oil off the Pembrokeshire coast last year, has been relaunched, amid claims that a European Commission regulation contributed to the accident. Shipping experts say the rule, which is meant to reduce the danger oil tankers pose to the environment, is having the opposite effect, as our transport correspondent Christopher Wayne reports.
When the Sea Empress hit the Milford Haven Middle Rocks last year, the initial oil spillage was small, because the worst damage was to an empty ballast tank. Although she was as big as 3 football pitches and carrying 130,000 tonnes of crude oil, Sea Empress had an environmentally friendly design. In conventional tankers, all the tanks hold oil and are interlinked. After discharge, seawater is used for ballast, and often this pollutes the ocean. It's the tar washed up on beaches. But Sea Empress had 4 segregated ballast tanks, which only held water, reducing the amount of oil she could carry. The European Commission says green tankers, those with double skins or segregated ballast, must be encouraged by exempting non-cargo space from harbour dues. Under the old system, Sea Empress was a 160,000-tonne ship needing 2 pilots. The segregated ballast rule made her a 130,000-tonner, needing only 1 less experienced pilot. Many UK pilots have complained the regulation was daft because ships were just as big.
Pilots have a tremendous problem with these large ships. They're more susceptible to windage, which you wouldn't necessarily think about. They're more beamy, slightly less easier to maneuver, and they suffer interaction effects more strongly on the sea bottom.
Although even trainees are international master mariners, it takes years to become a fully qualified ship's pilot. They start on coasters and work their way up.
Number 1, full weight, starboard bow.
Before handling supertankers, they spend months helping senior pilots. And if the port authorities can afford it, weeks in simulators like this one in Holland. Here, trainee Humber pilots are learning to dock safely in a force 9 gale, something they'd never expect to do in real life.
We've been on the wrong berth, Roy.
I'll take it with us.
Next week, the official Transport Department report into the Sea Empress incident is due to be published. Since the disaster, the ship's been repaired and renamed Sea Spirit and is now waiting to leave Belfast Harbour. In Milford Haven, they've changed the rules. Segregated ballast supertankers once again carry 2 pilots. But that's just a local measure. It hasn't resolved a community-wide problem caused by a badly drafted regulation which increases a danger it was supposed to help reduce. Christopher Wayne, BBC News.
A report by the American government has severely criticised Switzerland for its dealings in gold looted by the Nazis during the Second World War. According to the study, the Germans seized almost $5 billion worth of gold at today's prices, and much of it was handled by Swiss bankers.
After worldwide outrage from Jewish groups, President Clinton ordered the Nazi gold inquiry, even though it paints a damning picture of a friendly country, Switzerland, which the report says profited handsomely from one of the most powerful forces of evil in history. At the State Department, Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt said that after the war, the Swiss showed obdurate reluctance in revealing the truth.